Well, thanks very much for inviting me. Yeah, I'm not hugely sure of the background of everyone here, so I realise I may have included slightly less introductory stuff than I intended to, or I should have done. So I may pause on several things, and if you all look horribly blank, more so than I feel you did, then I'll stop and go over things. So please do shout out if there's any questions. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about neuromodulation, particularly in artificial neural networks today. As Scott said, a lot of my research was modelling biological systems, which I'm going to pretty much skip over. So, what I'll talk about, I'll give some biological background about the particular neuromodulator I'm talking about is nitric oxide, which is a gas which diffuses in our brains. But this kind of stuff applies, particularly the neural network stuff applies to any diffusible neuromodulator. So I'll give a bit of biological background. I'll then give some background to the GasNet stuff. And the GasNet is an artificial neural network which was developed by Phil Husbands and Mick O'Shea in the late 90s, which has got a standard sort of neural network with a diffusible virtual gas over the top of it. Who's familiar with neural networks? Particularly, okay, some people, most people. Okay, so that's good. Okay, and then this bit I probably won't get to too much. Well, I'll talk about a bit. The gas nets that we developed were shown to be more evolvable in some sense, or more adaptive. There's sort of a nicer class of network to work with than standard neural networks. And pretty much the research we've been doing for more years than I really care to think about is to try and work out why the gas nets in particular are better. And there are three working hypotheses at the moment. Well, many hypotheses, but these are three ideas which come from the definition of what a neuromodulator is. And the first one is that it's something to do with the fact that neuromodulators tend to work on different temporal scales to the electrical signals in your brain. So maybe it's something to do with that. Another thing is that neural networks, real brains and the neuromodulators and in artificial brains, you've got to embed your network in an actual space, a topological space, whereas in standard neural networks, in some cases, the space is arbitrary. So it could be something to do with this. And the third thing is it something just to do with its modulatory properties per se, in total, which it could be as well. So these are the three working hypotheses. I'm going to focus on this one, I think probably almost exclusively, looking at different temporal scales in networks. I don't know if many people know Chris and Seth, 2 rows back, they've done a lot of work on this, and so I will shamelessly be inspired by their work. Rather than plagiarise it as we go along. So yeah, so I'm going to focus on this, and especially I'm going to look at how gas nets compare to another class of neural network, continuous time recurrent neural networks. I apologise for all the acronyms, but they're too long to spell out, which is just another neural network, for those who don't know, which has got a temporal aspect to it. Okay, so the reason for this hopefully will become abundantly clear shortly. I'm almost certainly not going to talk about that, and I hopefully have taken out all the caveats. Okay, so to start with the biological background, the sort of classical picture of neurotransmission is that we've got electrical activation happening at synapses, and this thing happens over a short temporal scale, so you've got action potentials running along through your brain, and it's typically 5 milliseconds, I think, the length of an action potential, something like that. So it's very, very short, very quick. And the overriding metaphor that's been used over the years is of we've got basically electrical connections in our brains, electrical nodes connected by wires, and all these signals running along them, adding up and doing their thing. So this is the kind of the picture that we all love. So this is our heads, and we've got these little circuits in here, and everything's going along. And this picture sort of gave rise to the standard connectionist neural network. So for those unfamiliar with the neural network, basically this is a neural network that's controlling a robot. So we've got some input coming in through the eyes, and we have some notional electrical activity passing back along these wires, and these wires generally have got weights on them, and the stronger the weight, the more important the connection. So the weights will multiply the input, and they'll get added up at the nodes, and then they'll pass out to these nodes, and they'll do some more adding up and squashing and stuff, and they'll go back through here and out to the wheels, in this sense, the effectors. So this is supposed to be the idea that comes in. We've got input coming in through our eyes, gets processed in the brain, and then I reach for the Coke, or not. So this is the sort of standard sort of picture, and this has been held sway for many years. And there are very different flavours of neural network, more or less real or whatever. So this picture is clearly far oversimplified. Real brains, the single neurons are incredibly complex things. I mean, they're just pretty much beginning to work out some things about them, and they're very complex. You know, how synapses are made, and there isn't just a single synapse. You've got multiple synapses along where one neuron contacts another, and they tend to aggregate and stuff. They're very weird stuff they do. And so the brains basically involve many different interacting dynamical systems. And about 15 years ago, when I started doing this talk, it used to say about 10 years ago. But about 15 years ago now, they discovered that there were these gaseous diffusible neurotransmitters, nitric oxide, then later they discovered carbon monoxide, and recently hydrogen sulfide, all of which are highly toxic for various, probably evolutionary reasons. And these these basically allow now interactions between bits of brain that aren't linked by synapses. So these gases will spread out. Once they're given off, they'll just spread out. They're very small. Well, nitric oxide is very small. They'll just spread out pretty much isotropically. It won't be stopped by the sort of the shape of the synapse or anything like that. So it'll just spread out, and it can affect many different neurons in the same area. So you get this idea of so rather than things having to happen at the synapse, it can happen over a volume. So the idea of volume transmission. And so this kind of is gave a big difference to the sort of connection, this picture of the brain. So things are happening, and they tend to happen over a different timescale. And these gases are neuromodulatory, and from Katz defines neuromodulation as being communication between neurons which is caused by release of a chemical that's either not fast or not point-to-point or not simply excitation or inhibition. Okay? So this is, you'll notice by the definition, it's kind of setting up in opposition to electrical signalling. So it is, I mean, by the very definition, you can see that it was a just sort of different class of way of thinking about how the brain communicates with itself. So this is what we're looking at. So we're looking at these gases. They tend to diffuse relatively slowly compared to electrical signalling. So the gas will diffuse on a range of sort of hundreds of milliseconds rather than 5 milliseconds. And it'll happen over an area, and it tends to modulate what happens at the synapse. So rather than just adding a bit of electricity or adding a bit of current or taking a bit away, it can sort of modulate what's happening, so it'll boost it or change it and stuff like that. So this is a kind of different picture. So in particular, what I studied was nitric oxide. Nitric oxide was the first one that they found, and is probably the one they know most about. So it spreads out and can act as a volume signal. So this is the sort of picture we've got, as rather than affecting one neuron, it's affecting a whole region. It can act over a very wide range of temporal scales. It's got lots of different effects. It can set in effect genetic effects and stuff like that, and change the mRNA and stuff. So its action can last years. It's very heavily involved in learning. It's involved in vasodilation, modulation of sensory input. It's involved in lots of things. I mean, in general in the body, it's used to make your blood flow, and your white blood cells give it off to kill things, which is why it's highly toxic. So the white blood cells use it, and which is probably what it was first came into organisms to do as a sort of protective agent. But it also makes blood flow. So there's kind of only funny story I have about nitric oxide is that one of the drugs they used to give nitroglycerine to people in the 1900s to help angina and stuff like this. And when they were looking for a new heart drug to ease blood flow, they made this drug and they gave it to people. And it turned out to be Viagra, and it aided blood flow not in the heart but in other regions of the body. So that's as fun as it gets. So enjoy that. So it's very for me. What was important for me is it's highly reactive. It's very, very highly reactive, and you can't measure it directly. So to get an understanding of what happens, you have to model it, which was very good for me because I came to the department as a mathematician, not knowing much neuroscience, and they needed someone to do maths rather than to do biology, which was handy, otherwise I'd have been out on my ear. So what we've done is we model it with a combination of a sort of mathematical modelling and then a more abstract gas net model, which is this neural network type stuff. I'll just show you briefly some of the mathematical modelling stuff, mainly because there's nice pictures. So what we've been looking at recently is there's a structure in insect brains called the mushroom body, which is because it's basically shaped a bit like a mushroom, and it's the sort of seat of associative learning. So you get it's made up of about 50,000 these parallel fibres, which they've got in the calyx up here. They all sort of spread out, and they get input from I think from the olfactory neurons. So they get sort of odour input here, and they've got other afferent inputs coming in here. And the idea is that this thing is making the association between odours and other things. So this is kind of the seat of learning in the brain. And they know nitric oxide is involved in memory and learning in insect brains. We haven't got them. What a guy, Swidbert Ott, who is now in Cambridge, did, he's an anatomist. And so he stained for nitric oxide effectively, and found that there was two populations of these cells, and the ones in the centre were receptive to nitric oxide, and the ones in the exterior, in the wall, were made nitric oxide. They had this really nice sort of staining where this is the sort of this is staining for the receptor, this is staining for the enzyme that makes it, and you can see they're kind of negatives of each other. It's really much nicer pictures that I make, and I won't bother showing the movie particularly. So what we were looking at, so we've got this concentric organisation, so we're looking at how that particular morphology affects the type of signals you might see. And so I did some modelling. It's not terribly important. Modelled sort of a hollow tube where the outside, there's a subpopulation of neurons make NO, and just trying to see what happens. And you can see the nitric oxide diffuses into the centre, and you get a nice uniform signal in the middle. And we're just looking at the implications of this. And basically, because these fibres are very, very small, they're about half a micron in diameter, what we found was that a single fibre was completely ineffective as a signal. But if you had many of the fibres, then the NO would summate over this kind of area and region, and you'd get a good signal. And what we postulated is that this acts as some sort of low-pass filter to the brain. In the mushroom body, there's constantly sort of background firing of neurons, a sort of background crackle, and you don't want to make associations based on that. You want to make associations based when you've got a lot of neurons firing at one time. So this is sort of serves in some sense. What we postulate was these things are not connected with each other; they just sort of go downwards. So the idea is that somehow they're using the gas as a kind of non-synaptic integrator over both space and time, because you don't need the things to fire exactly at once. You just need them to set off this diffusion process, and then you get this kind of nice spread of nitric oxide in the middle. And we also found you get a reduction by measuring the concentration in the centre. You get a reduction in variability of the signal and things like that. So it had some nice properties. And that's kind of by the by. So that's the kind of sort of mathematical modelling stuff we do. And the idea is that from this we then get some ideas to put into artificial neural networks that might be useful. So for instance, this idea of the gas that being used as a low-pass filter, that evolved or it appeared in some networks that we evolved to as robot controllers, and it worked in much the same way. And it kind of is quite a nice way of doing a temporal filter. Okay, so nitric oxide itself was kind of the inspiration for this new form of artificial neural network known as the gas nets. So what we have here is we've got a standard neural network where we've got excitatory connections and inhibitory connections. And they're just kind of placed randomly in a space, as it were. But also the gases each neuron can emit a gas, either due to either high electrical activity or high chemical activity, or something like this. So what we've got is we've got the electrical connections, we've also got this gas sort of network going on underneath. And so we've got two distinct but interlinked signalling systems, electrical and chemical. And what's kind of important here is that the space is important, which I'll come to, and also temporal aspects are important. This gas spreads out over time as well. I'll just a bit more detail on that. So I'll just show one of these things in action. So this is... Okay, so this is going to look a bit odd. Oh, this is kind of off the screen a little bit. It should be okay. So this is a simulation of a robot, and it has to go towards the triangle and avoid the square. It's got a very, very minimal visual system. It's taking visual input from here, from these 3 pixels. You can kind of ignore this. This is just stuff going up and down. So this is the visual field. The pixels are connected to... This is the kind of space... Imagine this bit's white and showing up. So this is the network itself, and it's got taken... So this number 6 here, this pixel is giving input to this neuron over here. I hope this one works. Might not. And we'll just kind of see what happens. So there's this kind of electrical input going in. There's very, very few, what we often notice is very, very few electrical connections. There's only a few electrical connections here in this instance. There's not much else going on. Let's see what happens. Let's get rid of that. Oh, no, don't do that. Okay, so this should go towards that. And what you see is that as it goes along, gas is given off in a network, and this changes the properties of the nodes. And so we've got a kind of gas network going on over the top of the electrical one. So again, it's going to be very similar. As it sees it, when it's getting from visual input, this thing gets affected, and this thing gives off gas and kind of turns on. These ones in the corners are motor nodes, and it's basically fixing the thing going forward. What the robots tend to evolve is they tend to evolve a basic behaviour where they spin on the spot until they see either a triangle or a square. And they've got a basic bright object finding mechanism, which is normally implemented by the electrical signals. Now here, it starts to go towards it, but it gets inhibited by the gas again, and then goes towards the triangle, and hopefully we'll get there. It doesn't always work. And so it's kind of like you've got 2 different mechanisms going on. You've got a bright object finding mechanism, and then you've got a mechanism to decide, is it a triangle or a square? So it'll just spin on the spot. If it sees a bright object, it'll go towards it, unless it decides it's a square, in which case it'll carry on going. And in this case it'll go. Okay, that's enough of that. So that's the kind of idea. We've got these 2 systems linked, yet somehow distinct. And you can see that the gas kind of spreads out over time. Okay, it doesn't come on immediately. It's not like an electrical connection. It comes on and spreads a bit. Okay, so let's stop that. Okay. So, the diffusion in the gas nets, which will become clear. I won't go through all the details of what's going on, but basically, the gas cloud generally is centred on the emitting node, or as something else that's not important. It's generally centred on the node that's giving off the gas, and it's got a radius of action. It's got a sort of a variable rate of action which is specific to that neuron itself. And the concentration at a receiving node, so the concentration at this node here, so we assume this is the emitter and this is the receiver, is dependent, it's some function of the distance between the two neurons. So the concentration you get here is the concentration that is at the emitter at that time multiplied by a factor which is less than 1. Okay? So that's the sort of basic picture. Oh, I don't need to do that. So what's important is because the gas works on the distance between the things, the space that the nodes are embedded in is crucial to the action of the gas. The second thing is the sort of temporal aspect. So the gas concentrations at the emitter, they rise and fall. So say the electrical activity is high at the neuron, this gas will start to build up. And it will build up at a rate which is between 1 and 10 times slower than the electrical changes. And that's kind of important. And what it does is, the gas, it alters the slope of the transfer functions at the receiver. So, ignoring this equation a little bit, but basically, in a neural network, again, for those who haven't seen it, you basically sum up all the inputs multiplied by all the weights, and then you put it through a sigmoid function, which looks like this. Okay? And depending on the slope of the sigmoid function, it can be more like that, or it could be less squashed like this. And in ours, we allowed the sigmoid functions to go, the slopes to go negative. So you could sort of flip things from being positive to negative. So if you imagine we've got this thing emitting, and it's got a rate of rise of 3, then it would probably start off, it starts emitting, and there's a sort of spatial profile of the gas which is like this. And my slope has changed and gone down a little bit. It emits for a bit longer, and the slope changes again. It emits for a bit longer, and it changes to negative. Okay? But it happens over time. It's a rate of rise of 3, and then it stops emitting, and it will slowly die away. So it's got a rate of rise and a rate of decay of 3 in this case, but it can be 1 to 10. So you've got a temporal thing happening, and it modulates the sort of what's happening at the neuron. Okay. So what's important here to take away is that both the chemical and electrical are on different temporal scales. Okay, they're acting over different temporal scales, very different temporal scales, and that's important. Now, you kind of vaguely have to trust me on this because I'm not going to do it too much, but we tend to use genetic algorithms or evolutionary search to develop the gas nets, which is just a form of kind of stochastic optimization. And what we were looking at how easy it was to get good solutions using these base things as these base gas nets as controllers. The idea being that if it's easy to get solutions with these things, A, it would be good for evolution, and it also means, in some sense, they're kind of adaptable to new environments, and so it's a suitable kind of base for generating autonomous behaviour. And using the gas net on a number of robotic tasks, they were very good and they evolved very quickly. They evolved much faster than things with the gas turned off, and also to different types of network. And we developed various different variants of the standard gas net, which further improved the evolvability of the thing. And we did some analysis looking at the overlap of the two signaling systems, looking at the chemical signaling system and the electrical signaling system, seeing if they were connected to the same things, seeing if they were connected to different things, seeing lots of different things, which kind of sort of made us feel that you wanted some sort of loose coupling between the two signaling systems. Okay, so the question though is, we never really answered why we got this increase in evolvability. Why do the gas nets work particularly? Why do they work at all? A colleague of mine, Tom Smith, spent a very long and fun PhD finding reasons for why, or finding things that it wasn't. So he looked at analysis of search landscape properties and various different things, and there was no real difference between the gas net and one with the gas turned off. So that was kind of a bit of a red herring. So we started to look at more behavioural measures. And recently, mainly through conversations with Chris, look back at the definition of neuromodulation, which is looking at communication that isn't fast, it's not point-to-point, or it's not simply excitation or inhibition. So maybe it's these sorts of characteristics that we should be kind of probing to see if that's why the gas net itself was what we put in, see if that's the reason why it's better. So there's three linked hypotheses. That the reason it's good is that it's because the gas acts over a different and separate temporal scale to the electrical connections. Alternatively, it could be something to do with the spatial embedding of the network. I'm not really going to do this, or alternatively, it could be modulatory effects. Well, what I'm going to focus on today in the last 10 minutes or so is some work looking at this, looking at the action of the gas over different temporal scales. Okay, so the first sort of evidence for this, there's various bits of evidence for this. So the first sort of obvious thing to do is to kind of cripple your standard gas net so that the rise and fall of the gas happens immediately. So instead of there being a rate of rise of 3, where that thing rose slowly over 3 steps, it just rises immediately. And then it's working at the same temporal scale as the electrical network. So what I did, I made a new gas net called the instant gas net, and saw if it was as good as the other one, and it wasn't. It was basically, it was roughly half as good as the original. Okay, so that's some evidence that this, it is something to do with having different temporal scales available, which makes it work. Okay, so if this is the case, then if you've got a network where the electrical connections can also be slow in some sense. Hi, yeah.
Sorry, you said it was half as good as the original gas net. How much better was the original gas net than the non-gas net? So was the crippled gas net still better than the non-gas net?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Okay, so there are non-temporal advantages.
Yeah. And that one, that was actually, I was testing one of the variants there, and yeah, there's definitely non-temporal things, yeah. But I'll come to that briefly at the end. So okay, so if you've got this thing of this being slow, I mean, this kind of speaks to that as well, because this then, if it was just temporal, then the CTRNN should be just as good, effectively. So we're going to test it to, we're going to test the gas net against the CTRNN, which is a network which I like to put equations in. It's the kind of guy I am. So this is a continuous time recurrent network, or a leaky integrator. Basically, it's just like a sort of standard integrate and fire network, but you add in a bit of current from the previous time step, and it kind of gives the node temporal dynamics in similar ways as the gas has temporal dynamics, and it's all controlled by this parameter here, this Tor. And if you set this to Tor to 1, then these things become integrate and fire neurons. If Tor is greater than 1, then nodes integrate the activity over time, pretty much as the gas does. So I mean, it's not terribly important as the details, but basically this I always, whenever I talk about the gas net, there's Professor Harvey, or Dr. Harvey, is he Professor? Yeah. In Sussex would always say, oh, it's just like a CTRNN, you know, you're wasting your time. He does say that about most things, yeah. But anyway, so this was so I'm going to test against this, and some work that Chris did was looking at CTRNN style or gas nets made to look like CTRNNs made to look like gas nets, and he seemed to some work he did seemed to suggest that there was having an explicit separation between nodes, having some nodes that were explicitly fast and some that were allowed to range in temporal dynamics was good for the system. And this is what we see in nervous systems. You know, we've got some things are fast, and some things are slow. And normally in any kind of, I mean, I'm waving my hands wildly, but any sort of complex dynamics, you have a fast and a slow parameter. That's how you get interesting dynamics in systems and stuff like that. Okay, so this is some work done by a student of mine, Sven Mag, who's now in Hertfordshire. And he was looking at central pattern generating tasks. So he just wanted a task, just had a network that produced, I think in this one, 4 zeros and a 1, and then 4 zeros and a 1. okay? And he kind of ignored it. Basically, the gas nets were significantly better than these ones are CTRNNs. There were various different flavours of CTRNN. And even the sort of best one, I think that's an instant one, in fact. It's very strange results, but they got to a better solution. They got there much, much quicker. So these took sort of, 40 times longer to evolve than the gas nets, which was good, I thought. However, being thorough, he then tested it on a pattern where you had 7 ones being generated with 5 zeros. And it turned out the gas nets were worse than the CTRNNs, which was a bit of a blow, really. So the question is why? I mean, why is there this difference for different patterns? So I've come at this thinking it's something to do with temporal dynamics, but then I get this problem where the CTRNN seems fine on one and not so good on the other. There's also work by a guy called Gary McHale who looked at evolving walking gaits for a quadruped and a biped, and he found similar things. He found on some of them, and he found that the gas nets were always of the best ones, were some of the best, and he found them to be as good as and more general than CTRNNs. But I don't think that's always true. I mean, there's not huge differences here between them, but there are significant. I mean, we tried to make the gas nets look much better here, and they really weren't, so did the best to massage the results. Okay, so this is a kind of vague hypothesis that I've come up with, is that the patterns, the difference in the patterns is that there's a difference in the balance between ones and zeros. So the first one was 4 ones and then 1 0, and the other one was sort of almost equal ones and zeros. Now, CTRNNs always have the same on and off dynamics. So this is, if you imagine a CTRNN gets an input like this, just a square wave, then its pattern of activation, it'll slowly ramp up, it'll exponentially ramp up, and then exponentially ramp down. And this is a mirror image of this, okay? So it's got the same on and off dynamics for a node. Whereas gas nets, kind of through a combination of the modulation that's inherent in it, and kind of also through some of the structure of the temporal dynamics, they have different on and off dynamics, partly through a bug that was originally in the code as well, which we don't like to talk about. But that's, so they have different on and off dynamics. And my working hypothesis is this allows a range of different behaviours. Some work that Chris did as well was looking at if you actually explicitly had a different off dynamic for the gas, it worked better, didn't it, in something. So this is my working hunch. So it might be that you don't want to have this kind of nice symmetrical nature. You want to have some nasty stuff going on and give you a rich range of output dynamics. Okay, so that's kind of a working hypothesis at the moment, and clearly would need a bit more investigation before convincing anybody. If this was the case, then Sven sort of said, well, if the timing is unimportant, what if I use these things on a reactive task where you don't need timing? So most of the tasks we've tested the gas net on always use timing. They're tasks that need some sort of inherent timing. So it's no surprise that gas nets, which have got timing, work quite well. So he tested it on this, there's a minimally cognitive task, a kind of relatively famous one in AI, where an agent has to, if it sees a diamond, it goes and catches it. If it sees a ball, it avoids it, something like that. And it's claimed that this is a reactive task, so that timing in this task is unimportant. And Sven tested he tested 2 types of CTRNN, one where it was just a purely reactive network and one that isn't, and they both did this thing very quickly, very easily, and very well. Whereas the gas nets, and this was the gas nets that he tested, was here, didn't do nearly as well and took a lot longer to do it. So this kind of somehow bears out the thing. Well, here again, the gas net's worse than the CTRNN, but it's on a task which doesn't involve timing. So maybe, you know, if you don't need timing, then there's no point having this gas net. It's not doing anything other than altering the timing. However, when he tested it against the no gas version, then the gas net, the one with gas in, did better. So that kind of muddies the waters a little bit. Clearly timing is doing something, but it's not doing everything. So it's not simply that the gas nets are just sort of timing elements. And in fact, he sort of stripped down the gas net to make it into a CTRN, and he found out that it was the addition of weights that helped the network. It was nothing to do with the timing and nothing to do with the kind of the spatial embedding or the how you encoded the networks or anything like this. It was purely to do with weights.
What does additional weights mean?
So in the GasNet standard thing is that you've only got either the connections are weighted as either +1 or -1. So he added real weights in, and it worked. Okay, that's kind of sort of important. So the question then becomes, I mean, is it simply timing that aids GasNet evolvability? Is it just the addition of time? So very, very briefly, it's not. It doesn't seem to be anyway. Another student did, he made a gas version of a CTRNN, and that worked much better than the standard CTRNN. Okay? So maybe from this one would say that it's modulation which is the key. So having this modulatory effect in it works. Well, that's fine, but then we look back at our results on different flavors of GasNet, and we've got some that are 10 times better than other ones. So it's not just modulation. They're also modulatory, they also work in the same time frame, so it's not that. So is it something to do with the spatial embedding? Something to do with the space within which they're embedded? And possibly there's... It could be that. So to summarize, basically different temporal scales do seem to aid evolvability and temporal adaptivity, and in both real and artificial nervous systems you see that these slow time scales can be used to filter noisy inputs, and it does seem that some sort of explicit separation of the different mechanisms might be useful. In terms of mathematical dynamics, having this modulatory high, allowing the slopes, I don't know if anyone works with neural networks, but it's kind of like if you allow the slopes of your transfer functions to go a lot higher than 1, you get a much richer range of dynamics. You get much more, more attractors and stuff like that in phase space. You get much nicer properties. Basically, there are differences between GasNets and CTRNNs, and I think it might be due to differences in the on and off temporal dynamics, but I could be convinced otherwise. Okay, I'm not going to talk about evolvability and coupling. Let's talk about some very new work that might be of interest. This is sort of coming back to the idea that it's something to do with the space within which the networks are embedded. Basically, these are graphs of looking at the connectivity of electrical and of the networks based on this sort of modularity measure that the guy Peter Fine's been using. And these are two styles of network. This is the original style of network we had. This is a new variant of the GasNet that I developed, and this one was much better than this one. And when we looked at the patterns of connectivity, almost all the original ones came out as very sort of disjointed networks, whereas the plexus was seen to be more interconnected, which was somewhat counterintuitive to me, but then turning my huge brain on the subject, it all became obvious. So that's just to throw that in. So there's something to do with space, there's something to do with the spatial embedding, there's something to do with time.
So those lines, do they represent electrical connections and gas connections?
They do, but they're not strictly that. It's something to do with shortest path length and stuff like that. I don't fully understand it. Did Pete come to the... He's on the...
Yeah. Right, we haven't talked about this yet.
No, it's quite new stuff. But yeah, it is effectively, it's strong connections, I think. Yeah, either electrical or chemical. And he did the stuff, he looked at then the nets in isolation, and electrical, unsurprisingly, were exactly the same as each other, but chemical were the ones that were different. So the chemical networks were more sort of diffuse for the, which surprised me actually. But yeah, you might have got it wrong. Okay, this is not important. This was just looking at the coupling of the two signaling systems over an evolutionary history, and in one it went up in a nice line, which I claim to be significant out of about 100, but it's too nice a line for it not to be true. Anyway, I think, how can order happen by accident? Okay, so yeah, just to summarise, different, this is probably what I've just said this already, different and explicitly separate timescale scales seem useful. There's no clear winner between teacher and hands and gas nets, though I wish there were, especially if the weights are used. There are differences which might be due to the on-off dynamics. There's some stuff about coupling which I haven't really talked about, so I'll ignore. What about modulation? Intuitively, to me anyway, modulation is like a multiplication where, so you've kind of got these chemical connections which are multiplicative and electrical connections which are additive, and I think this is almost certainly stealing from Chris, but it might be the combination of two signalling channels that you've got. You've got fast additive electrical connections and slow modulatory multiplicative gases. You get independent behaviour on different timescales and rich adaptive dynamics in general. I have referenced him just to, so that he doesn't hate me. And future work will all be solved. So these are my two. These are the guys who came up with GasNet in the first place. These guys are my well, it's not my student. These guys did some of the work. Peter Fines, you saw a little bit of his work. Chris gave a lot of the inspiration for this and some of the words. And we had a complex networks workshop several years ago, which Seth and Richard were at, which provided a lot of the ideas that are sort of behind this, I think. And I've been funded by EPSRC and BBSRC. And thank you very much.
Got time for maybe 5-10 minutes of questions?
You don't have to ask anything. I can go home.
Something that Chris mentioned to me today, some grains are very, very small, like grains of locusts.
Mm.
And I've always thought about gases in terms of like big human brains, where a neuron gives off gas and there's like, so it's a small part of your brain that gas is going to affect.
Yeah.
A lot of neurons. But in a locust, presumably, if it gives off some gas, then suddenly it's affected a large portion of the. So neuromodulators today, are they present in tiny little brains?
Yeah. I think the large and small is being, when I say it works over a large spatial scale, it's very, very small, large spatial scale. It's not sort of tens of microns, it's like 100 microns or something. So, I mean, the NO and stuff is, most of the work, I think a lot of the work's been done in vertebrates, because they've got a lot more structures with nitric oxide in it, I think. And they've got very, very big neurons that you can stab easily and move around. So they are in that, but it's only sort of hundreds of microns. So when we say it's going to affect a large area, we're talking about, just outside the range of conventional neurotransmitters. So rather than being tens of, rather than being neighbouring synapses, it would be neighbours and next neighbours, I would think, and not much more than that, apart from when it's acting on blood flow. And like dopamine and stuff, which is going to go around the whole brain, which is different because that's stuck inside, it can't move past the synaptic cleft. So,
well, there is a certain diffusible aspect to like the serotonergic system and the dopaminergic system can go into the extracellular fluids and stuff. So you do, and there's lots of interest in volume transmission for all these macromolecular processes now. So there are many parallels with the nitrous oxide kind of ideas and maybe
Yeah.
serotonin in vertebrates like the SDG or tritonium, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even though the macromolecular, they still kind of fuse over quite large spaces, including and have a volume
Yeah.
effect. So.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't preclude any of the things, particularly in the GasNet stuff, from being. I mean, because there you've got almost things happening in the whole brain. I guess my reaction against it is the modelling stuff. My modelling stuff is completely hopeless for any complicated stuff like the dopaminergic system and that sort of thing. So I always have to show the caveat that I can't use it.
By Katz was actually a response to the definition of neuromodulation as a wider system, not just nitrous oxide, which is one very new and important case. So I think looking at how this work extends into other kind of diffuse systems is quite important. I think.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't. I mean, particularly for the GasNet stuff, I should keep it broader and that sort of thing. Okay.
Last speaker again.
Right. Cheers.